The fluorescent lights in Chicago Memorial's ICU hummed with the kind of persistence that made 12-hour shifts feel like days. Sophia Chen had learned to measure time not by the clock on the wall, but by the rhythm of ventilators, the beeping of monitors, and the quiet desperation that lived in the spaces between heartbeats. Tonight marked her 14th consecutive night shift in 21 days. Her student loan payment sat 3 weeks overdue, and her reflection in the darkened window showed a woman of 26 who looked a decade older at 3 a.m., dark hair escaping its bun, pale skin that hadn't seen proper sunlight in weeks, eyes that had witnessed too much death. Chicago's skyline glittered beyond the glass. She'd treated gunshot victims and heart attack patients in the same hour, a city of wealth and poverty bleeding together. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The distinction between deserving and undeserving patients had dissolved somewhere around her second year of nursing school, replaced by the understanding that suffering recognized no hierarchy. Everyone bled the same red, screamed the same way, died with the same desperate grip on hands that couldn't hold them back from the edge. Room 304 had admitted its patient 6 hours into Sophia's shift. Elena Volkov, 73, presenting with severe pneumonia and respiratory distress. The admission paperwork listed her as a widow, no known allergies, insurance information provided by her son who'd arrived in the ambulance with her, his presence commanding attention from the moment the elevator doors opened. Sophia had been restocking supplies when she first saw him. Dante Volkov moved through the ICU like a storm system, a charcoal suit perfectly tailored despite the 2 a.m. emergency, dark hair silvering at the temples, eyes the color of winter ice. The attending physician stammered while explaining Elena's condition. Nurses whispered about the security detail in the waiting area, 3 men who radiated violence barely contained beneath expensive suits. Sophia had grown up in Chinatown, where her parents ran a small restaurant. Her father had taught her to read the temperature of rooms, to recognize the men who never raised their voices but always got their way. Dante Volkov belonged to that world several levels above the street operators who occasionally ended up in her care. The nurses called him Mr. Volkov, with the deference usually reserved for board members, though his occupation remained conspicuously absent from all paperwork. She'd taken over Elena's care at shift start, performing routine vitals checks. The older woman slept fitfully, breathing assisted by oxygen but stable. Dante had been present for every check, positioned in the chair beside his mother's bed, with the stillness of someone comfortable with waiting. He never used his phone, never fidgeted, never displayed the nervous energy most family members exhibited in the ICU's fluorescent purgatory. His attention moved between his mother's face and the doorway, tracking every person who entered with the awareness of someone who understood that danger didn't announce itself with sirens. "How is she?" he'd asked during Sophia's 10 p.m. rounds, his voice surprisingly gentle given the intensity of his presence, the question revealing concern that didn't match the cold control he projected. "Stable for now," Sophia had answered, checking the IV line with practiced efficiency. "The antibiotics are working, but pneumonia in elderly patients can be unpredictable. The next 48 hours are critical." His eyes had met hers then, really looked at her for the first time, and Sophia felt the weight of that attention like a physical thing pressing against her chest. "You'll tell me immediately if anything changes," he'd said. Not a question but an all. Expectation delivered with absolute certainty of compliance. "Of course," she'd replied. Because what else could you say to a man who commanded rooms without raising his voice, who wore authority like other people wore cologne, whose mother's chart listed an emergency contact number that connected directly to someone's private line rather than going through any switchboard? The shift had continued with the relentless pace that defined ICU nursing, medication rounds, documentation, responding to alarms that sometimes meant nothing and sometimes meant everything. Sophia's feet ached in shoes designed for comfort but failing after hour 9. Her lower back sent sharp reminders that proper ergonomics were luxuries 12-hour shifts didn't accommodate. At 11:47 p.m., she'd been updating charts at the nurse's station when Dr. Harrison approached. Richard Harrison, the ICU's night attending, 50-ish with the worn competence of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human fragility. He'd been reviewing labs on his tablet, his expression showing the focused concern that came before difficult conversations with families. "Elena Volkov's white count is elevated beyond what the pneumonia explains," he'd muttered, more to himself than to Sophia, though she was the only person within earshot. "I'm ordering additional cultures and a toxicology screen. Something doesn't add up." Sophia had nodded, making notes in her own tablet, the documentation that would protect them all if questions arose later. Medical intuition wasn't something that translated to charts, but experienced physicians learned to trust when labs and symptoms didn't quite align, when patterns emerged that suggested complications beyond the obvious diagnosis. She'd drawn the blood samples herself at midnight, Elena stirring slightly as the needle found her vein but not waking, her breathing still labored despite the oxygen. Dante had watched from his chair, his gaze tracking Sophia's movements with the intensity of someone cataloging every detail, storing information for purposes she couldn't guess and probably shouldn't know. The lab results wouldn't return for hours, the overnight crew working through the backlog of tests from all units. Sophia had moved on to other patients, the ICU's constant demands leaving no time for speculation or worry beyond immediate clinical needs. At 1:23 a.m., she'd been checking Mr. Peterson in 308, adjusting his IV drip while he slept, the medicated sleep of post-surgical recovery, when movement in the corridor caught her peripheral vision. A man in scrubs she didn't recognize, pushing a supply cart past Elena's room with movements that seemed slightly wrong. Too purposeful, maybe, or too casual. The kind of performance that drew attention by trying too hard not to. Chicago Memorial employed hundreds of staff across all shifts. Sophia couldn't possibly know everyone, but the ICU maintained tighter security than other units, access controlled through badge readers that logged every entry, nursing staff maintaining territorial awareness of who belonged in their domain and who was passing through for legitimate reasons. This man didn't belong. The recognition came from instinct rather than conscious thought. The same instinct that had kept her family safe in neighborhoods where gangs marked territory through violence, where survival required noticing things before they became threats. His scrubs were correct, his badge lanyard present, his demeanor professionally neutral. But something in his posture, the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes checked corners rather than patient rooms, triggered alarms that had nothing to do with medical equipment. Sophia finished with Mr. Peterson, documenting the adjustment in his chart before stepping into the corridor. The man had stopped outside 304, Elena's room, consulting a tablet in a way that looked staged. Staff checked tablets constantly, but usually while walking, efficiency driving, every movement in understaffed units. This pause felt deliberate, calculated, wrong in ways she couldn't articulate but deeply understood. She approached the nurse's station, positioning herself where she could observe without being obvious, her hands busy with paperwork that didn't require her full attention. The man glanced toward Dante's security detail in the waiting area, measuring distance and sightlines with eyes that had done similar calculations before. Then he entered Elena's room with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going and why. Sophia's heart rate accelerated, adrenaline sharpening her awareness as her mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he was respiratory therapy, though RT usually announced themselves. Maybe he was from another unit covering a break, though ICU nurses rarely left their patients unattended. Maybe he had legitimate business that only seemed suspicious because Sophia's exhaustion was making her paranoid. Or maybe her instincts were screaming for reasons she should trust. She moved toward 304, her pace measured, nothing in her body language suggesting alarm. Through the door's window, she could see Dante sitting beside his mother, his attention on Elena's face with the kind of focus that suggested prayer, though his hands remained empty of rosary or phone. The stranger stood near the IV pole, his back blocking her view of what exactly he was doing, but his movements had the practiced efficiency of medical personnel who'd performed the same action thousands of times. Changing an IV bag, routine procedure, happened constantly throughout every shift, except Elena's IV had been replaced less than an hour ago during Sophia's rounds. The bag had been nearly full, the line clear, the flow rate correct. There was no medical reason to change it again so soon. No order in the chart authorizing a medication adjustment that would require a new bag. The realization crystallized with the sharp clarity of emergencies, when time seemed to both slow and accelerate simultaneously, when decisions had to be made faster than conscious thought could process all variables. Sophia's hand found the pen in her pocket, the cheap ballpoint from a pharmaceutical rep that wrote consistently despite hospital policy prohibiting drug company promotional items. She grabbed a blank progress note from the station, the paper trembling slightly in her grip, as she wrote 4 lines in handwriting compressed enough to be discreet, but legible enough to be read quickly. Her nursing training screamed that this was insane, that she had no proof, that professional protocol required reporting suspicions through proper channels. But proper channels took time. Time for paperwork and chain of command. Time for whatever was in that IV bag to enter Elena's bloodstream. Time for a woman to die while Sophia followed rules that protected institutions rather than patients. She folded the paper once, her heart hammering against her ribs hard, enough that she felt it in her throat. Then she pushed through the door into 304, her expression professionally neutral despite the terror crawling up her spine like spiders made of ice. "Mr. Volkov," she said quietly, approaching with the note palmed in her hand like contraband, like evidence of a crime that hadn't happened yet, but was unfolding in real-time inches from his mother's sleeping form. "I need you to review some paperwork regarding your mother's advance directives." It was bullshit. Advance directives were handled by social services during business hours, not by bedside nurses at 1:30 a.m., but it gave her a reason to be close to him, to extend the folded paper in a gesture that could be mistaken for official documentation if anyone was watching. Dante's eyes narrowed fractionally, his gaze moving from Sophia's face to the paper to the stranger still working at the IV pole. Intelligence flickered across his features, the kind of quick assessment that came from years of reading situations where misunderstanding meant consequences more permanent than embarrassment. He took the paper smoothly, unfolding it against his thigh where his body blocked the view from the stranger's position. Sophia watched his eyes move across her handwriting, watched the microscopic changes in his expression that another observer might miss but she'd been trained to notice. The slight widening of his pupils, the tension suddenly coiling through shoulders that had been relaxed, the way his breathing changed from deep and steady to shallow and controlled. 4 lines written in blue ink that felt like they were burning through the paper. "Poison in IV. Your mother. Room 304. Trust no one." The moment stretched thin as surgical thread, everything balanced on the edge of action and reaction. The stranger finished his work at the IV pole, disposing of the old bag in the biohazard container with appropriate protocol, his movements betraying nothing beyond routine competence. He turned toward the door, nodding politely to Sophia in the universal acknowledgement of one medical professional to another. "Respiratory therapy logged vitals," he said casually, the explanation fitting perfectly into the landscape of normal hospital operations, the kind of statement that would raise zero suspicion from anyone not already primed to see deception. Except Sophia could see the new IV bag hanging where the old one had been, could see the slightly different color of the fluid inside, could calculate that Elena's medication orders hadn't included anything that would require a mid-shift change of this nature. And now Dante could see it too, his gaze locked on that bag with the focus of someone identifying a threat he hadn't anticipated finding here, in this sterile room where his mother was supposed to be safe. The stranger left, the door closing with the soft click of hydraulic hinges designed not to disturb sleeping patients. Sophia's hands shook as she checked Elena's vitals on the monitor, the numbers still stable but meaning nothing if poison was flowing into her veins through tubing designed to deliver healing rather than harm. Dante moved with speed that contradicted his stillness, standing in one fluid motion that suggested violence held barely in check. His hand reached for the IV line, and Sophia's nursing instinct overrode her fear, her fingers catching his wrist before he could rip it free. "Don't," she whispered urgently, aware that sudden removal could cause air embolism or other complications. Aware that they needed to think, not just react. Aware that she was touching a man whose power she'd only guessed at until this moment. Feeling the coiled strength beneath expensive fabric and civilized presentation. "Let me clamp it first. We do this right or you could hurt her more than whatever's in that bag." Their eyes met, and in that moment Sophia saw past the cold control to something raw beneath. Fear, rage, desperation, the universal terror of someone watching a parent die and being powerless to prevent it. It made him human in ways his presence hadn't allowed before. He released the line, stepping back to give her room to work, his hand already reaching for his phone as Sophia clamped the IV tubing above the infusion site, stopping the flow with the plastic clip designed for exactly this purpose. She disconnected the contaminated bag, her training taking over despite her racing pulse, disposing of it not in the room's biohazard container but wrapping it in protective covering that preserved evidence. "I need this tested," Dante said into his phone, his voice carrying command that expected instant compliance. "Now, send Marcus to Memorial's ICU, room 304, and find the man in scrubs who just left this floor. Medium height, dark hair, approximately 45. He doesn't leave the building alive unless I give different orders." The words should have terrified Sophia, should have sent her running to hospital, security, to her supervisor, to anyone with authority to handle situations that involved threats of violence and organized crime. But instead, she felt a strange calm settling over her as she started a new IV line, drawing up saline from sealed containers she retrieved from the locked medication cart, using supplies she'd watched arrive and inspected herself. "Your mother needs fluids," she said quietly, working with steady hands that belied her internal chaos. "I'm starting a clean line. But I need to report this to the attending physician, to security. There are protocols." "No." The single word carried absolute authority, Dante's attention dividing between his mother and the doorway as footsteps approached from the corridor. "Not yet. Not until I know who sent him and who else in this hospital might be compromised. You reporting this starts an investigation that warns whoever ordered this that they failed. I need them confident they succeeded long enough to make mistakes." The logic was sound even if the methods were criminal. Sophia's hands continued their work, muscle memory allowing her to function while her mind tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. She'd saved a woman's life tonight. And in doing so, had made herself visible to people who killed mothers in hospital beds, who corrupted medical care into murder, who operated in a world where nurses who noticed too much became problems requiring solutions. The door opened and a man entered who could only be Marcus, moving with the controlled efficiency of former military. He wore street clothes rather than a suit, his build suggesting gym hours and combat training. His eyes swept the room, cataloging threat levels before settling on Sophia with an assessment that felt invasive despite its professionalism. "The bag," Dante said simply, gesturing toward the wrapped IV where Sophia had placed it on the room's counter, away from Elena but preserved for whatever testing he had access to that. Likely didn't involve hospital labs or legal chain of custody. Marcus took it without comment, his gaze returning to Sophia with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "She saw?" he asked Dante, the question heavy with implications about witnesses and loose ends and the permanent solutions men like this employed to maintain operational security. "She saved my mother," Dante replied, his tone carrying warning that didn't need elaboration. "Which makes her untouchable. Spread the word through all channels. Anyone who looks at her wrong answers to me personally." The protection felt more like a cage than Sophia wanted to admit, but arguing seemed both pointless and potentially dangerous. She focused on Elena, checking her vitals again, monitoring for any signs that poison had entered her system before Sophia's intervention. The older woman's breathing remained steady, her color good despite the illness, the monitors showing stability that suggested they'd acted in time. Marcus left as quickly as he'd arrived, the IV bag disappearing with him into whatever shadow network Dante maintained throughout Chicago's infrastructure. Hospital security would have no record of his visit. Cameras mysteriously offline or footage mysteriously corrupted. The kind of technical problems that plagued institutions with too much to monitor and too few resources. Silence filled the room like water, pressing against Sophia's ears until she could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of everything that had just happened settling onto her shoulders like wet concrete. She finished connecting the new IV line, double-checking the flow rate, documenting the change in Elena's chart with clinical language that revealed nothing of the truth beneath. "Why did you warn me?" Dante asked finally, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond the room's walls, quiet enough to feel intimate despite the circumstances. "You didn't know what was happening. You could have been wrong. You could have gotten yourself killed." Sophia looked at Elena's face, peaceful in sleep, unaware how close death had come, wearing hospital scrubs and carrying credentials that granted access and trust. "Because she's someone's mother," she answered simply, the truth requiring no complicated explanation. "And I became a nurse to keep people alive, not to stand by while they're murdered in beds where they should be safe." Something shifted in Dante's expression, a crack in the armor that revealed depths she hadn't expected. Not softness exactly, but recognition maybe. Acknowledgement of principles that transcended the practical calculations that governed his world. Respect for someone who'd acted on instinct rather than strategic advantage, who'd risked herself for a woman she didn't know simply because it was right. "You understand what you've done?" he asked, the question carrying weight beyond its simple words. "What this makes you now?" Sophia nodded slowly, exhaustion mixing with adrenaline, as her body tried to process 12 hours of work plus crisis management that nursing school hadn't covered. "I've made myself visible to people who prefer operating in darkness. I've proven I see things I shouldn't notice, and now you feel obligated to protect me from consequences I created by protecting your mother." "Not obligation," Dante corrected quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Debt. In my world, that's more binding than any contract. You saved what matters most to me. That creates bonds that don't dissolve easily." The implications stretched before her like a road disappearing into fog. Sophia could feel her carefully constructed life, her plans for finishing her degree and eventually becoming a nurse practitioner. Her dreams of stability and security earned through hard work rather than circumstances, all of it shifting beneath her feet like sand, giving way to deeper water. "I should get back to my other patients," she said, needing distance to process what had happened, needing space away from Dante's intensity and the truth of what she'd just involved herself in. "Your mother is stable. The new IV is clean. I'll check on her every 30 minutes for the rest of my shift." Sophia. Her name on his lips stopped her at the door. The sound of it somehow different than when other people said it, weighted with knowledge and consequence. "Thank you. For seeing what no one else did. For acting when silence would have been safer. For being exactly who you are even when it costs you." She looked back at him, this dangerous man who loved his mother enough to wage war against whoever had tried to kill her, who commanded violence but offered gratitude with genuine warmth, who existed in a world that would now include Sophia whether she wanted it or not. "Your mother reminds me of mine," she said quietly, the confession surprising herself as much as him. "And I'd hope someone would do the same if my family needed help." Then she left before her voice could break, before the trembling in her hands became visible, before the magnitude of everything crashed over her in waves she couldn't suppress. She made it to the staff bathroom before the shaking started, before her body released the tension it had held through crisis, before tears she hadn't known were coming burned tracks down her cheeks. She'd saved a life tonight, and possibly ended the quiet anonymity that had kept her safe in a city where noticing too much got nurses disappeared into Lake Michigan's depths. The shift continued, because hospitals didn't stop for personal drama. Sophia moved through her remaining rounds with automatic efficiency, checking vitals and dispensing medications and documenting everything in charts that would never reflect the truth of what had happened in room 304. The rest of Sophia's shift passed in a blur of hypervigilance masked as routine care. Every footstep in the corridor made her pulse spike. Every unfamiliar face became a potential threat. The man in scrubs hadn't returned, but his absence felt more ominous than his presence, suggesting he'd either escaped or been caught by Dante's people. Neither outcome offering Sophia any real comfort. Elena's vitals remained stable through the night, her breathing gradually improving as legitimate antibiotics fought the pneumonia that had brought her here. Dante never left his mother's side, his stillness somehow more present than other family members' anxious pacing. Sophia checked on her every 30 minutes as promised, their eyes meeting briefly each time with understanding that required no words. At 6:47 a.m., Dr. Harrison returned with the toxicology results that Sophia had almost forgotten ordering. His expression carried the grim satisfaction of clinical intuition proven correct, though he couldn't possibly understand the full scope of what those results revealed. "Elena's blood work shows traces of digoxin," he explained to Dante, his voice carrying the careful neutrality physicians employed when delivering bad news. "At levels inconsistent with any medication she's been prescribed. Given her cardiac history, digoxin toxicity could have easily been mistaken for complications from her pneumonia. If not caught early, it would have caused fatal arrhythmia within hours." "How did it enter her system?" Dante asked, his tone suggesting he already knew but needed official confirmation, needed the medical establishment to validate what Sophia's note had warned. "Doctor," Harrison glanced at Sophia, questions flickering across his features before professional discretion suppressed them. "The timing suggests IV administration rather than oral ingestion. Nurse Chen changed the IV line around 1:30 a.m. due to..." He checked his tablet, finding only Sophia's clinical documentation that mentioned malfunction of the infusion pump. Nothing about poison or murder attempts or men in scrubs who didn't belong. Technical issues. "That likely saved your mother's life, Mr. Volkov. Another hour of that infusion and we'd be having a very different conversation." The attending physician's words hung in the air like incense, blessing actions that had violated every protocol Sophia had been trained to follow. She'd acted on instinct rather than evidence, had interfered with medical equipment without authorization, had passed information to family members before alerting supervisors. Any of those violations could cost her license if investigated thoroughly. But Elena was alive, and sometimes outcomes mattered more than procedures, even if hospital administration would never officially acknowledge that truth. "I'd like to move my mother to a private facility," Dante stated rather than requested, his decision clearly already made regardless of medical opinion. "Somewhere with better security protocols than this hospital can apparently provide." Dr. Harrison stiffened at the implied criticism but nodded acceptance. "Patients with Dante Volkov's resources didn't require approval for transfer decisions. She's stable enough for transport. I'll prepare the discharge paperwork." though I'd recommend continued monitoring for at least 48 hours given her age and the toxicity complications. That will be arranged, Dante assured him, his gaze finding Sophia across the room where she was updating Elena's chart with the morning vital signs. I'd like Nurse Chen to accompany the transport. My mother responds well to her care. The request landed like a stone in still water, ripples of implication spreading outward. Doctor? Harrison looked between them, clearly sensing undercurrents he couldn't quite identify but recognizing they existed beyond his authority to question. That's irregular, but if Nurse Chen is willing and her supervisor approves the overtime. Every instinct Sophia possessed screamed that agreeing meant stepping further into a world she didn't understand, accepting protection that would come with expectations she couldn't predict. But declining felt impossible with Dante's eyes on her, with Elena's life still hanging in whatever balance existed between her son's power and his enemy's determination. I'm willing, she heard herself say, the words feeling both inevitable and terrifying, sealing something that couldn't be unsealed, agreeing to terms she didn't fully comprehend but somehow knew she couldn't refuse. The logistics of transferring an ICU patient happened with surprising speed when money eliminated bureaucratic friction. Sophia's supervisor appeared personally to approve the overtime, her usual strictness dissolved by whoever had made whatever phone calls created this exception to every hospital policy. A private ambulance arrived within the hour, staffed by paramedics whose military bearings suggested training far beyond civilian emergency services. Sophia gathered Elena's medical records, medications, and personal belongings, her hands moving through familiar tasks, while her mind tried to calculate what she was really agreeing to. The private facility Dante mentioned turned out to be a medical suite within his own home, equipped with hospital-grade monitoring equipment and staffed by what Marcus casually mentioned were former combat medics who'd transitioned into private security after leaving the service. The drive through Chicago's early morning traffic felt surreal. Sophia sat in the back of the ambulance with Elena, monitoring vitals that remained blessedly stable while the city transformed from her familiar landscape of bus routes and corner stores into neighborhoods where homes hid behind gates and trees. They traveled north along the lake, away from the crowded density of the city proper into areas where wealth bought distance from the world Sophia knew. Dante's estate occupied waterfront property in Evanston, the kind of location that suggested old money despite his relatively young age. The house was substantial without being ostentatious, modern architecture, incorporating natural materials in ways that felt organic rather than showy. Security cameras tracked their approach, discreetly positioned but comprehensive in their coverage. The medical suite occupied the entire east wing, equipped better than some rural hospitals Sophia had rotated through during training. 2 rooms with full ICU capabilities, a pharmacy stocked with medications that required DEA licensing to possess, monitoring equipment that reflected the latest technology. A gray-haired woman in scrubs introduced herself as Catherine, former Army nurse with 30 years of experience including field hospitals and places she didn't name but whose memory lived in her eyes. We'll take good care of Mrs. Volkov, Catherine assured Dante, as they transferred Elena to a bed that looked considerably more comfortable than the hospital's standard issue. And Nurse Chen is welcome to stay as long as needed to ensure continuity of care. The assumption that Sophia would stay beyond the immediate transfer settled over her like a net, carefully woven and impossible to escape without causing damage she couldn't afford. She helped settle Elena, checking the new IV line that Catherine had expertly placed, verifying medication dosages and updating charts that existed only in this private system, accountable to no regulatory agency or hospital administration. When Elena was finally stable and resting comfortably, Dante touched Sophia's elbow with unexpected gentleness. "Walk with me," he said quietly, the request somehow feeling more binding than any demand could be. They stepped out into a garden that overlooked Lake Michigan, November cold biting through Sophia's scrubs despite the weak morning sun. The water stretched gray and endless toward a horizon where sky and lake blended into single element, beautiful and indifferent to human concerns about mortality and debt and consequences. The man who changed the IV worked at Memorial for 6 months, Dante began without preamble, his hands in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cold air. Credentials verified, background checked, no red flags. He was activated specifically for last night's attempt, which means someone has been planning this for months, placing assets, waiting for opportunity. Sophia wrapped her arms around herself, shivering from cold and delayed shock as the enormity of the conspiracy crystallized. "And now they know it failed," she said quietly, following his logic to its inevitable conclusion. "Which means they'll try again, and they'll wonder how it failed." "Who warned you?" Hospital security footage from the ICU has already been reviewed, Dante confirmed, his tone matter-of-fact despite the implications. You entering the room, passing me the note, the timing of the IV change immediately after. It's not conclusive evidence, but combined with the fact that you're the nurse who ordered the toxicology screen. He trailed off, letting her understand without spelling out every detail of her exposure. So I'm a target now. Sophia finished for him, the words tasting like metal in her mouth, the reality of it settling into her bones like cold. Because I saw what I shouldn't have seen and acted when I should have stayed blind. Dante turned to face her fully, his expression holding something that might have been regret, or simply recognition of consequences. Neither of them had chosen, but both now had to navigate. I've already taken steps to protect you. Security at your apartment building has been upgraded, though subtly enough that you wouldn't notice without looking for it. Your route to and from work is being monitored. Your family's restaurant has cameras watching approaches and exits. The thoroughness should have been comforting, but instead felt like surveillance, like being claimed without consent, like her life was no longer entirely her own. You investigated me, she said, not quite accusation but definitely not gratitude. Anger, threading, through fear in ways she couldn't fully separate. I protect what's mine, Dante replied simply, the possessive pronoun landing heavily between them. And you became mine the moment you saved my mother. Whether you wanted that or not, whether I wanted that or not. The bond exists now. Denying it doesn't make you safer, it just makes you more vulnerable. Sophia's nursing training had taught her triage, how to assess situations and make rapid decisions about resource allocation and acceptable losses. But nothing in her education had prepared her for this calculation, weighing her independence against her survival, her principles against the practical reality that principles didn't stop bullets or prevent poison from being slipped into drinks at restaurants she frequented. What exactly are you offering? She asked, needing clarity even if the answer terrified her, needing to understand the terms of protection that Dante considered inevitable. Safety, he answered, his gray eyes holding hers with intensity that felt almost physical. Real safety, not the illusion of it that most people accept as sufficient. You continue working at Memorial if you choose, but with protection that ensures nobody touches you without consequences they're not willing to face. You live your life, finish your degree, pursue your goals, but you accept that you're under my shield now, which means you're also in my world. And what does being in your world cost? Sophia pressed, needing to hear him name the price even though she suspected it couldn't be articulated in simple terms. Dante considered the question, his gaze drifting to the lake before returning to her face. Awareness, he finally said. You can't pretend anymore that you don't see the machinery beneath the surface, the networks of power and violence that actually govern Chicago. You can't claim ignorance when you witness things that should be reported to authorities I don't trust and who don't control outcomes. You become complicit through silence, even if you never actively participate. The honesty surprised her, the lack of sugarcoating or false promises about how nothing would change except she'd be safer. He was offering her clear sight of exactly what accepting his protection meant, letting her make an informed decision even if the alternatives were significantly worse. I need to think, Sophia said, though they both understood thinking was just delay, that the decision had already been made the moment she wrote that note, that she'd chosen sides without fully understanding the battle's scope. Think here, Dante suggested, gesturing back toward the house. Stay with my mother for the next 48 hours while the antibiotics work and we ensure no lasting damage from the digoxin. Catherine has a guest room prepared. Your supervisor has approved the extended leave, and you'll be safe while you consider options that don't include walking back into your apartment tonight without knowing who might be waiting. The scenario he painted was specific enough to be credible, detailed enough to suggest he'd already imagined exactly how his enemies might move against her if given opportunity. Sophia found herself nodding acceptance before consciously deciding to agree, her survival instinct overriding her desire for independence, her recognition that safety sometimes required surrender to those with greater capacity for violence. The next 2 days unfolded in a strange domestic rhythm that felt nothing like the hospital's controlled chaos. Sophia monitored Elena's recovery with Catherine's assistance, the older nurse providing professional expertise tempered with maternal warmth that made the medical suite feel less clinical. Elena improved steadily, her pneumonia responding to aggressive treatment, her system clearing the digoxin without permanent cardiac damage. When Elena finally woke fully on the second afternoon, her first words were in Russian, soft and confused, before switching to English as awareness returned. Dante? She called, her voice hoarse from intubation she'd received briefly during the worst hours of her illness. "I'm here, Mama," Dante answered immediately, materializing at her bedside with speed that suggested he'd been nearby despite Sophia not seeing him enter. His hand found Elena's with gentleness that contradicted everything Sophia had witnessed of his cold control, his thumb stroking her knuckles with the tenderness of a child who'd learned early that mothers were mortal. Elena's eyes found Sophia next, recognition flickering despite the haze of illness and medication. "You saved me," she said, the statement carrying absolute certainty, despite having been unconscious during the critical moments. "Dante told me what you did, what you risked." "I did my job," Sophia deflected, uncomfortable with gratitude for actions that now felt more complicated than simple medical intervention. Uncomfortable with the debt Elena seemed determined to acknowledge. "No," Elena corrected gently, her English carrying the lilting accent of someone who'd learned the language later in life but mastered it completely. "You did more than your job. You saw danger and warned my son when staying silent would have been safer. That's not duty. That's character." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus entering with information that changed Elena's expression from grateful to grim. He spoke to Dante in rapid Russian, the syllables harsh and urgent, their meaning lost on Sophia, but clearly significant based on Dante's response. His jaw tightened fractionally, his eyes going cold in ways that reminded her exactly who he was, beneath the concerned son's facade. The hospital surveillance wasn't the only footage, Dante explained to Sophia after Marcus departed, his tone carefully neutral despite the tension radiating from his posture. "The Koslov family obtained copies before my people could completely sanitize the records. I know you warned me. They know you're the reason their attempt failed. And they've put a price on information about your routines, your vulnerabilities, your family." The words landed like physical blows, each one driving air from Sophia's lungs until breathing became a conscious effort. "My family," she repeated, the phrase encompassing her aging parents who still worked 80-hour weeks at their restaurant, her younger brother finishing undergraduate studies at Northwestern, her grandmother who'd emigrated from Taiwan and still spoke limited English. "They're not part of this. They don't know anything. They're leverage," Dante said bluntly, not cruel but honest in ways that cut deeper than cruelty. "The Kozlovs will use whatever tools achieve their objective. You care about your family, which makes them valuable for coercion or punishment, depending on what message needs sending." Sophia's hands clenched into fists, nails biting into her palms hard enough to hurt. The pain, anchoring her as panic threatened to overwhelm rational thought. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, hearing the defeat in her own voice, hating it but unable to pretend she had options that didn't exist. "Accept my protection completely," Dante answered, his tone softening slightly as he added, "which means your family accepts it too, whether they understand why or not. Your parents' restaurant gets a silent security upgrade. Your brother gets watchers on campus, who look like other students. Your grandmother's assisted living facility gets additional staff who report to me rather than their official employers. They stay safe, but they also stay visible to my people, which ensures the Koslovs understand that touching them means war I'm prepared to wage." The thoroughness of his planning suggested he'd been considering this scenario since the moment Sophia passed him that note, calculating contingencies and allocating resources, before she'd even fully understood the danger. It should have comforted her, this evidence of his capacity to protect what he considered his. Instead, it highlighted how completely her life had been absorbed into his world, how little choice she retained beyond the illusion of agreement to inevitable outcomes. "My family can't know the truth," Sophia said firmly, the one boundary she felt capable of defending even as everything else crumbled. "They immigrated legally, worked impossibly hard to build something legitimate. I won't have them believe I've endangered everything they sacrificed for by getting involved with." She gestured vaguely, unable to find words that accurately captured what Dante represented, without sounding melodramatic or offensive. "Organized crime?" Dante supplied with the faintest hint of amusement cutting through his intensity. "You can say it, Sophia. I'm aware of what I am, and what the world calls people like me. Your family will be told you've been threatened by a disturbed patient's family members, that I'm providing security as a thank you for saving my mother, that it's temporary until the threat resolves. All of which is technically true from certain angles. The rationalization felt thin but functional, a story her parents might accept without asking questions that would require lies. "And how long does temporary last?" Sophia asked, already suspecting the answer but needing to hear him acknowledge it. Until the Kozlovs are neutralized or deterred sufficiently that their cost-benefit analysis makes trying again unprofitable, Dante explained, his business terminology wrapping violence in sanitized language, which could be weeks or months depending on how they choose to respond to the message I'm about to send. Sophia didn't ask what message he planned to send or what methods would deliver it. Some knowledge felt more dangerous than ignorance, some complicity too explicit to claim the moral distance she still desperately wanted to maintain. She looked at Elena, sleeping peacefully now that crisis had passed, her survival the catalyst for everything that followed. I saved her because she's someone's mother, Sophia said quietly, more to herself than to Dante, trying to reconnect with the simple moral clarity that had motivated her action before complications obscured the initial good. Because watching someone die without trying to prevent it isn't who I am. But I don't know who I'm becoming by staying here, by accepting your protection, by letting you make my family part of your world without their knowledge or consent. Dante moved closer, not touching but near enough that she felt the heat of his presence, the intensity that seemed to radiate from him like force field. You're becoming someone who survives in a world that kills people for seeing too much, he said, his voice low enough to feel intimate despite the clinical setting. Someone who understands that morality in practice is more complicated than ethics in textbooks. Someone strong, enough to live with contradictions that would break people who need simpler narratives. His words shouldn't have resonated, shouldn't have felt like validation rather than corruption. But Sophia recognized truth in them despite her resistance, acknowledged that her nursing experience had already taught her that the world didn't divide neatly into good and evil, that people were complicated and circumstances more so, that sometimes the right choice involved breaking rules designed to protect institutions rather than individuals. I want to see my family, she said finally. The request also a test of whether his protection included her autonomy or replaced it with control wearing benevolence's mask. Before you upgrade their security without explanation, I want to see them, talk to them, prepare them for changes they won't understand. Dante nodded acceptance immediately, surprising her with his lack of resistance. Marcus will drive you tomorrow morning. Your parents expect you for lunch at the restaurant. They've been told you're working extended hours at a private care assignment, nothing that would alarm them but explaining your absence from your apartment. The fact that he'd already contacted her family, already constructed the narrative they'd been told, should have angered her. Instead, Sophia felt a strange relief that someone had thought of details she'd been too overwhelmed to consider. Protection apparently included managing the logistics of deception, ensuring stories aligned before questions arose that would require improvisation. That evening, Sophia finally allowed herself to sleep in the guest room Catherine showed her to, exhaustion from 36 hours of wakefulness crashing over her the moment she lay down on the bed. Her dreams were fragmented and anxious, populated by men in scrubs who changed IV bags while her parents served dumplings to customers who all looked like Dante. Variations on themes her subconscious couldn't resolve into. Coherent narrative. She woke to pale November sunlight filtering through curtains she didn't remember closing, her phone showing 11 missed calls from her mother, and 3 text messages, asking if she was eating enough and whether she needed them to send food. The maternal concern felt like an anchor to normalcy, reminding her that some things remained unchanged despite the earthquake restructuring everything else. Marcus appeared exactly when he'd promised, driving a sedan that looked ordinary enough not to draw attention but probably cost more than her parents' annual income. He maintained professional silence during the drive back toward Chinatown, not unfriendly but clearly understanding that his role was protection rather than conversation. Her parents' restaurant occupied a corner storefront that had housed their dream for 18 years, the sign written in Chinese characters her grandmother had chosen for their auspicious meanings. The lunch crowd was already forming when Sophia entered, the familiar smell of ginger and scallion hitting her like memory made tangible, the sounds of Mandarin and English mixing in conversations that filled the small space with life. Her mother emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on her apron, her face lighting up with the kind of joy that made Sophia's chest ache with complicated love and guilt. Xiaofen, she called, using Sophia's Chinese name that no one else remembered she possessed. You look exhausted. Come, sit. I make you soup. Her father appeared next, shorter than Sophia now but still commanding in the way that fathers remained in their children's eyes. Working too much, he diagnosed without asking, his English precise despite limited practice. You need rest, not more shifts. The irony of his concern would have been funny if everything weren't so desperately complicated. Sophia let them feed her soup and dumplings and tea while the lunch rush swirled around them, her parents maintaining conversation, despite obviously needing to help with service. Her brother David joined them, surprised by her unexpected appearance but pleased enough to skip his afternoon class to visit. "So this private care gig?" David asked, his Northwestern education evident in his casual American English that their parents sometimes struggled to follow. "Must pay pretty well if you're doing extended hours. Covering more of those loans?" Sophia nodded, the lie sitting heavy on her tongue but necessary. "The family is wealthy, grateful. They've offered substantial compensation for dedicated nursing. All technically true if lacking critical context about why gratitude translated to security details and protection." Her mother touched Sophia's cheek with work-roughened hands, her eyes showing the concern that transcended language or cultural barriers, maternal intuition that sensed something wrong despite the surface explanation. "You are safe?" she asked, the question carrying weight beyond its simple words. "This family, they treat you with respect?" "Yes, Mama," Sophia assured her, the truth complicated but present. "They're very respectful. I'm safe with them. Safer than she'd be anywhere else given the circumstances, though that reality remained mercifully hidden from maternal worry. The afternoon stretched into early evening as Sophia helped during the dinner preparation, falling into familiar routines of chopping vegetables and rolling dough, her hands remembering skills learned in childhood before nursing school redirected her path. The restaurant's rhythm soothed something in her that hospitals and Dante's estate couldn't reach, connecting her to identity that existed before everything became complicated. But she noticed the new camera above the entrance, positioned discreetly but covering the approach from both directions. Noticed the man who'd been sitting at the corner table for 3 hours, ordering minimally but watching constantly. Noticed the modifications to the back exit that looked like standard maintenance but suggested reinforcement beyond code requirements. Dante's protection had already arrived, invisible to her family but glaringly obvious to Sophia once she knew what to look for. The restaurant she'd grown up in had been absorbed into his network, her parents' legitimate business now shielded by the same power structure that made her a target. When she finally left, Marcus appearing exactly on schedule to drive her back to the estate, where Elena continued recovering, Sophia turned back to see her parents waving from the doorway, their faces filled with love and pride for a daughter who'd become a nurse, who was working hard, who made them proud despite the sacrifices required. They couldn't see the invisible walls now surrounding them, the watchers tracking approaches, the security protocols disguised as their daughter's successful career advancement, and Sophia would make sure they never knew the truth about what she'd done to save a stranger's mother, and what that single act of compassion had cost their carefully constructed legitimate life. The 2 weeks following Sophia's family visit passed in a rhythm that felt surreal in its domesticity despite the violence simmering beneath the surface. Elena recovered fully, her strength returning with the resilience of someone who'd survived worse than pneumonia and poison. She insisted on teaching Sophia to make pelmeni, Russian dumplings that required patience and precision, her kitchen filling with flour, dust, and laughter that seemed impossible given the circumstances that had brought them together. "You have good hands," Elena observed one afternoon, watching Sophia crimp the edges of dumplings with the careful attention to detail that nursing had trained into her. Steady, gentle. "My Dante needs someone with hands like that in his life. Too many people around him have hands that only know how to break things." The comment was anything but subtle, maternal, matchmaking transcending cultural boundaries and criminal contexts. Sophia felt her face flush, her fingers fumbling the dumpling she'd been forming. "Mrs. Volkov, I'm here as your nurse, not, you're here because you saved my life," Elena interrupted gently, her accented English carrying firmness that suggested where Dante had learned his command. "Because you saw danger, and warned my son when staying silent would have been safer. That makes you family, Sophia. The rest is just details waiting to be resolved." The assumption that romance was inevitable, rather than impossible, left Sophia speechless, uncertain how to navigate maternal expectations that ignored every rational reason why a nurse and a mafia boss represented a catastrophically bad idea. But before she could formulate a response that wouldn't offend, Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that killed all thoughts of dumplings and matchmaking. "Dante needs you in his office," he said to Sophia, his tone professionally neutral, but his posture suggesting urgency. "Now." Elena's face tightened with recognition that transcended language, the expression of someone who'd lived with danger long enough to read its presence in Messenger's bearing. "Go," she urged Sophia, squeezing her flour-dusted hand briefly. "And remember that my son doesn't ask for help easily. If he's calling for you, he needs what only you can provide." Sophia washed her hands quickly, following Marcus through corridors she'd learned over the past 2 weeks her heart rate accelerating with each step toward Dante's office. She'd been in the room only once before, immediately after arriving at the estate, her memory cataloging dark wood furnishings and windows overlooking the lake, and the sense that important decisions were made here with consequences that rippled far beyond these walls. Dante stood at the windows when she entered, his back to the door, his posture rigid with tension that contradicted his usual, controlled stillness. He wore dark slacks and a white dress shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the informal attire somehow making him seem more dangerous rather than less. On his desk sat a laptop displaying what appeared to be medical charts, the familiar formatting immediately recognizable despite the distance. "Close the door," he said without turning, his voice carrying strain she'd never heard before, something raw beneath his usual command. Sophia closed the door, moving further into the office with the cautious approach she'd use with unstable patients, uncertain what crisis had produced this version of Dante, who seemed barely contained. "What's wrong?" she asked, medical training overriding intimidation as she assessed him with clinical attention. "Are you injured?" He turned then, and Sophia saw his face properly for the first time. Not injured physically, but something had clearly landed a blow that armor couldn't deflect. His eyes held fury and something that looked disturbingly like fear, emotions she hadn't thought him capable of displaying so openly. "The Kozlovs didn't just target my mother," he said, each word precisely articulated despite the rage threading through them. "They've been systematically poisoning me for the past 6 months. Small doses, carefully calibrated to appear like stress-related symptoms. Fatigue, headaches, occasional tremors I attributed to coffee and lack of sleep. The attack on my mother wasn't their primary plan. It was meant to look like grief and stress finally killed me after losing her." The medical sophistication of the strategy sent ice through Sophia's veins, her nurse's mind immediately calculating dosages and timelines, while her civilian consciousness reeled at the cruelty of killing a son slowly while murdering his mother quickly. "What are you being poisoned with?" she asked, already moving toward the laptop to examine the charts, her training overriding any thought about whether she should be involving herself further. "Thallium," Dante answered, the word heavy with implications that extended beyond its chemical properties. "The toxicology came back an hour ago from blood work my doctor ordered after I mentioned the tremors. He thought it might be a thyroid issue. Instead, he found levels consistent with chronic low-dose exposure." Sophia studied the lab results, her nursing knowledge contextualized by the criminal psychology courses she'd taken as electives. Thallium poisoning was rare, difficult to diagnose, and historically favored by intelligence agencies and organized crime for its subtlety. Symptoms mimicked common stress-related conditions, and by the time proper diagnosis occurred, damage was often irreversible. "How are you being exposed?" she asked, mentally cataloging the vectors: food, water, environmental contact. "If it's been 6 months of consistent dosing, the source has to be something you interact with regularly, probably daily. That's why I need you," Dante said, moving to stand beside her at the desk, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with something sharper, possibly the metallic tang that sometimes accompanied heavy metal toxicity. "My doctor wants me hospitalized immediately for chelation therapy, but I can't trust hospital security after what happened with my mother. And my own medical staff, while competent, might be compromised if someone's been dosing me this long under their noses." The implications settled over Sophia like weight. "You want me to treat you here," she said, understanding immediately why he'd called for her specifically. "Because I'm the only person in your life who's proven I'll act to save you rather than just following orders that might be covering murder." "You see things others miss," Dante confirmed, his gray eyes holding hers with intensity that felt almost physical. "You notice patterns that trained professionals overlook, because they're not looking for treachery within systems designed to be trusted. I need those eyes now, Sophia. I need someone who'll question everything and everyone until we find the source." The request was impossible and inevitable simultaneously, asking her to become not just his nurse but his investigator, his protection against betrayal from within his own organization. "I'm not qualified for chelation therapy," she protested, even as her mind was already working through protocols and medication regimens. "That requires specialized knowledge. Monitoring that, Catherine is qualified," Dante interrupted. "Former military medicine includes treatment for chemical weapons exposure and heavy metal contamination. She can handle the technical aspects. But she's been here for 3 years, part of my regular medical staff. If someone's been poisoning me successfully for 6 months, they've been doing it around her without raising suspicion. I need fresh eyes verifying every step, questioning every assumption." The logic was sound even if the methodology existed somewhere outside legal medical practice and probably violated a dozen regulations. Sophia looked at the charts again, her nursing instinct warring with her self-preservation instinct, her desire to help conflicting with her recognition that involving herself further meant stepping past points of no return she'd barely acknowledged reaching. "If I do this," she said carefully, "I need complete access. To your home, your office, your security team, your food preparation, your personal care items, everything. And I need the authority to question anyone, including people you trust implicitly. Otherwise, I'm just guessing in the dark." Dante nodded once, acceptance and relief flickering across his features. "You have it. Marcus will inform everyone that you have my full authority to investigate anything and question anyone. Refusal to cooperate gets treated as complicity in attempted murder." The blunt declaration of power sent a chill through Sophia even as she recognized its necessity. In Dante's world, half measures got people killed. She was either all in with the authority to actually investigate, or she was useless window dressing that provided false comfort while poison continued its work. "Show me your daily routine," she said, her nurse's training taking over, creating structure from chaos through systematic assessment. "Everything from when you wake up to when you sleep. Every beverage, every meal, every location, every person you interact with consistently." The next hour unfolded in detailed interrogation, Sophia taking notes on her phone while Dante walked her through days that followed patterns she wouldn't have expected from someone in his position. He woke early, usually around 5 a.m., coffee prepared by his personal chef who'd worked for the family for 15 years. Breakfast at 6:30, meetings from 7 through lunch, afternoons divided between legitimate business interests and the shadow operations that actually defined his power. Dinners often at restaurants or social obligations, evenings reviewing reports and making decisions that moved millions of dollars and determined people's fates. "The coffee," Sophia said, her mind catching on the detail that stood out through its consistency. "Every morning, prepared the same way by the same person for years. That's your most predictable exposure point." Dante's expression darkened. "Victor has been with my family since before I was born. He came from Russia with my parents, helped them build everything they have. The idea that anyone close to you would betray you seemed impossible until you found thallium in your blood." Sophia interrupted gently but firmly, recognizing the denial that came when trust confronted evidence. "I'm not saying it's definitely him. I'm saying we eliminate possibilities systematically, starting with the most obvious vectors." The investigation that followed consumed the next 3 days, Sophia coordinating, with Catherine, to begin chelation therapy while simultaneously analyzing every aspect of Dante's environment with the attention to detail that had made her a good nurse. She interviewed staff, examined food preparation areas, tested water sources, reviewed security footage of every person who'd had access to spaces Dante occupied. Victor, the chef, submitted to questioning with dignified cooperation, his hurt at being suspected obvious, but his understanding of necessity equally clear. "If someone is using my kitchen to poison Mr. Volkov, I want them found and dealt with," he said in heavily accented English, his weathered hands clenched into fists. "This family gave me everything. My loyalty is absolute." But absolute loyalty meant nothing if someone was exploiting that trust, using Victor's predictable routines to introduce contamination without his knowledge. Sophia spent hours in the kitchen, watching meal preparation, reviewing inventory, tracking the chain of custody for ingredients from delivery to consumption. The coffee proved to be clean, the beans tested and found uncontaminated. Same with the water, the food, every obvious vector that Sophia could identify, which meant the source was something less obvious, something embedded so deeply in routine that even careful observation might miss it. On the third night, exhausted from combining investigation with medical care, Sophia stood in Dante's office reviewing her notes while he worked through paperwork that apparently couldn't pause for attempted murder. The chelation therapy was working, his lab values improving, his symptoms gradually resolving, but knowing he was healing didn't solve the mystery of how he'd been poisoned in the first place. "Your hands," she said suddenly, the observation crystallizing as she watched him sign documents with a fountain pen, his movements precise despite the tremor that still occasionally affected his fingers. "You use that pen constantly. Every signature, every document. How long have you had it?" Dante looked at the pen as though seeing it for the first time, his expression shifting as connections formed. "It was a gift," he said slowly, his voice dropping to something dangerous. 6 months ago, from Yuri Koslov himself. He said it was a gesture of goodwill after negotiations over territory disputes in the west suburbs, a show of respect between adversaries. Sophia moved around the desk, her hand extended. Let me see it. He passed her the pen, and even without testing, Sophia could see what she'd missed before. The elaborate metalwork wasn't just decorative, it included small perforations near where Dante's fingers would grip during use. Contact points for dermal absorption, delivering poison through skin that remained exposed for hours each day as he worked through the endless paperwork that governed his empire. Son of a bitch, Dante breathed, his fury controlled but absolute as he stared at the weapon that had been hiding in plain sight. A gift-turned assassination tool that he'd carried with him everywhere, poison transferring to his system through the simple act of conducting business. He gave me the murder weapon 6 months ago, and I've been killing myself with it every day since. The revelation crystallized everything, the timeline, the method, the psychological cruelty of making Dante complicit in his own slow death. Sophia carefully wrapped the pen in a plastic specimen bag from her nursing supplies, preserving evidence even though she suspected it would never see a courtroom. The chelation should eliminate most of the accumulated thallium, she said, her clinical voice providing structure despite the emotional intensity crackling through the room. But you need to avoid any further exposure. That means changing everything you touch regularly, pens, keyboards, anything that might have been contaminated through transfer from the original source. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Dante nodded, but his attention had shifted to something beyond medical treatment, his mind clearly calculating responses that had nothing to do with healing and everything to do with retribution. The Kozlovs tried to kill my mother and poisoned me over 6 months using my own routine against me, he said, his tone carrying the cold certainty of someone who'd made decisions that couldn't be unmade. That requires a response that makes trying again so costly they'll never consider it. Sophia understood she was standing at a crossroads, witnessing the moment when Dante transitioned from defensive protection to offensive retaliation, watching violence prepare to escalate in ways that would inevitably draw her deeper into his world. She could object, could try to convince him that evidence and law enforcement represented better solutions than whatever he was planning. But she'd been in his world long enough now to understand that his reality operated on different principles than the legal system she'd been raised to trust. When you do what you're going to do, she said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. Your mother doesn't need to know the details. She's just started recovering. Stress could cause complications. The concern was genuine. Medical advice wrapped around tacit acceptance of inevitable violence. Dante's expression softened fractionally. Recognition that Sophia was choosing to protect his mother rather than lecture him about morality, prioritizing Elena's well-being over abstract principles about justice and proportionality. You're right, he agreed quietly, moving closer until they stood separated by less distance than professional relationships typically maintained. My mother doesn't need to know what's coming, but you do, Sophia, because you're going to be safe from it. But you need to understand why Chicago is about to see a change in its organizational structure. The next 72 hours unfolded in a pattern Sophia would later struggle to fully reconstruct. Events moving with the speed of landslides once the first stone dislodged. She continued Dante's chelation therapy, monitoring his recovery while deliberately remaining ignorant of the operations Marcus coordinated from secure locations throughout the estate. But ignorance proved impossible when the news started reporting unusual activity in Chicago's criminal underworld. 3 high-ranking Koslov lieutenants disappeared the same night, their absence noted by families who filed missing persons reports that police seemed curiously unmotivated to investigate thoroughly. A warehouse fire in the industrial district destroyed what reporters called significant property, while carefully avoiding speculation about what kind of property or why the fire department's response had been delayed by mysterious equipment failures. Elena watched the news with tight-lipped recognition, her eyes finding Sophia's with understanding that transcended language. This is because of me, she said quietly during one broadcast about federal agents investigating organized crime connections to recent disruptions. Because someone tried to kill me and hurt my son. This is because someone chose violence and is now experiencing consequences, Sophia corrected gently, refusing to let Elena shoulder blame for being targeted. You didn't create this situation. You're just recovering from being its victim. The distinction mattered legally, if not morally, maintaining boundaries that Sophia needed even as those boundaries became increasingly theoretical. She was treating the man orchestrating what amounted to a gang war protecting his mother while he destroyed his enemies, existing in a space where medical ethics and criminal complicity overlapped in ways her textbooks had never addressed. On the fourth night after discovering the poisoned pen, Dante appeared in the medical suite where Sophia was reviewing Elena's charts with Catherine. He looked different, not injured but marked somehow. Violence clinging to him like cologne despite his obviously recent shower and fresh clothes. His hands were clean, his appearance civilized, but something in his eyes suggested he'd been places and done things that had altered him in ways visible only to those who knew what to look for. "The threat is neutralized," he said simply, his voice carrying finality that suggested discussion would be neither welcome nor productive. "The Kozlovs no longer have the capacity or will to target my family or anyone under my protection. That includes you, Sophia, and your family." The relief should have been absolute, the knowledge that she could return to her normal life without watchers tracking her movements or poison, potentially waiting in hospital corridors. But Sophia found the feeling more complicated than simple relief, mixed with other emotions she didn't want to examine too closely. "What did you do?" she asked. Not sure she wanted the answer, but needing to hear how he'd classify actions that had consumed 4 days and resulted in what news reports were calling a major disruption to organized crime in Chicago. "What was necessary?" Dante answered, moving to sit in the chair beside his mother's bed, his posture showing exhaustion that went beyond physical. "Nothing more than they earned through their choices. Nothing less than what protecting what's mine required." The possessive again, claiming Sophia and Elena and everything else he'd decided fell under his shield. The word choice, revealing how fundamentally he viewed relationships as property requiring defense. It should have bothered her more than it did, should have triggered resistance against being claimed without her explicit consent. But Sophia was too tired for outrage, too aware that his possessiveness had probably saved her life, and definitely saved his mother's, too honest with herself to pretend she hadn't chosen this when she wrote that note warning him about poison in an IV bag 2 weeks ago that felt like a lifetime. "You need rest," she said, her nurse's assessment overriding other complications. "The chelation therapy works better when you're not flooding your system with stress hormones. Whatever you did today, it's done now. Tomorrow you focus on recovering." Dante smiled slightly, the expression transforming his face in ways that reminded Sophia he was human beneath the cold control, capable of warmth and humor, and the vulnerability that exhaustion revealed when defenses dropped. "Are all nurses this bossy?" he asked, the question carrying affection rather than criticism. "Only the good ones," Sophia replied, surprising herself with the ease of their banter, with how natural it felt to order around a man who commanded violence and made grown men disappear. "Now go to bed before I have Catherine sedate you for medical non-compliance." He left obediently, his submission to medical authority somehow more intimate than any touch, and Sophia found herself smiling at his retreating back before catching Elena watching her with the expression of maternal satisfaction that transcended cultures and circumstances. "You're good for him?" Elena observed, her English carrying the certainty of someone who'd watched her son long enough to recognize when someone affected him differently than others. "He listens to you in ways he doesn't listen to anyone except maybe me. And he needs someone who sees him as human rather than just powerful." Sophia busied herself adjusting monitors that didn't need adjustment, uncomfortable with Elena's observation even though it resonated with truths she'd been avoiding. "I'm his nurse," she protested weakly. "Temporary medical care until the crisis passes, and life returns to normal." "Normal," Elena repeated, the word carrying gentle mockery. "You saved my life, uncovered who was poisoning my son, and stood beside him through days that would have broken someone who wasn't strong enough to bear the weight. That's not temporary nursing, Dorogaya. That's family." The Russian endearment landed softly, an invitation into belonging that terrified Sophia more than threats had. Because violence she understood, but this offered domesticity wrapped around danger, love entwined with criminal enterprise, the possibility that her future might include mornings making dumplings with Elena, and evenings discussing chelation therapy with the man who'd just restructured Chicago's underworld. That night, unable to sleep, Sophia found herself in the estate's library, floor-to-ceiling books suggesting Dante's interests extended beyond violence and business. She was examining a first edition of Tolstoy when footsteps announced his presence, his approach quiet but not stealthy, respecting her space while joining. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, moving to stand near the windows overlooking the lake, moonlight painting the water silver and black, beautiful and indifferent to human concerns about morality and consequence. "Too much to process," Sophia admitted, setting the book down carefully. 2 weeks ago I was just a nurse, working too many shifts to pay off loans. Now I'm treating heavy metal poisoning in someone who just orchestrated what the news is, carefully not calling a gang war, while his mother tries to matchmake between us like we're normal people capable of normal relationships. Dante turned from the window, his expression holding something vulnerable beneath the surface control. What if we are? He asked quietly, the question landing heavier than it should. Normal people who met in abnormal circumstances, but people nonetheless. You with your student loans and double shifts, me with my complicated family business, both of us trying to protect what matters while navigating a world that's messier than we'd prefer. The characterization of Mafia operations as complicated family business would have been funny if his tone hadn't been so serious, if his eyes hadn't been searching her face with intensity that suggested her answer mattered more than he wanted to admit. Sophia felt the pull of possibility, the dangerous temptation to accept his framework that reduced impossible complications to manageable challenges. We're not normal, she said, needing to maintain some connection to reality, even as it slipped through her fingers like water. You run an organization that solves problems through violence. I'm supposed to heal people, not help someone who hurts them. There's no world where this, she gestured between them, encompassing everything unspoken, makes sense or ends well. My mother thinks differently, Dante countered, moving closer, his approach careful like he was gentling a spooked horse. She sees you as already part of this family, already belonging here regardless of official titles or relationship definitions, and she's rarely wrong about people or their place in our lives. Sophia's breath caught as he stopped close enough that she could see silver threading through his dark hair, could smell his cologne mixed with something distinctly him, could feel the heat radiating from his body despite the space still separating them. What do you want from me? She asked, the question encompassing more than immediate circumstances. Everything, Dante answered with the honesty she'd come to expect from him, even when lies would be easier. Your skills, your insight, your presence. I want you here permanently, not as temporary medical staff, but as part of the structure that keeps my mother safe and keeps me alive. I want you protected not out of obligation but because you matter. He stopped, seeming to recalibrate. I want you to choose this, to choose us, to choose me, knowing exactly what that means and what it costs. The declaration should have been overwhelming, too much too fast after only 2 weeks of knowing him, too complicated given everything about their circumstances that screamed disaster. But Sophia had learned in nursing that sometimes you had to make decisions before you felt ready, that waiting for certainty meant letting patients die while you deliberated about perfect treatment plans that didn't exist. I need parameters, she said, her practical nature asserting itself even as her heart raced with equal parts fear and something that felt disturbingly like hope. If I stay, if I become whatever permanent role you're describing, I need boundaries. I treat patients who need medical care regardless of how they're connected to your organization. I don't participate in violence even if I'm aware it's happening. And my family stays protected but separate. They don't get drawn deeper into your world than security requires. Dante nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he'd expected negotiation and respected her for demanding it. Agreed. You practice nursing according to your ethics. I handle my business according to mine, and we trust each other to maintain those boundaries. Your family stays safe and ignorant of details they're better off not knowing. And you live here, where safety is guaranteed, and where my mother will be insufferably pleased to have you as permanent presence. The terms were clear, the offer explicit, the decision hers to make without pressure, despite the underlying reality that refusing meant losing the protection that kept her alive. But Sophia realized the choice felt less coerced than she'd expected, motivated less by fear than by the complicated truth that she'd found something here she hadn't known she was looking for. Community, maybe. Or purpose that extended beyond patient care into actually preventing harm before it occurred. Or possibly just connection with people who saw her completely the good and the complicated and wanted her anyway. I'll need to give notice at memorial, she said. The practical statement also an acceptance that shifted everything. 2 weeks minimum, maybe a month to train my replacement properly, and I want to finish my nurse practitioner degree, which means continuing classes even if it complicates security. Already arranged, Dante said, his smile holding triumph tempered with something softer. Your supervisor has been contacted about a long-term private care position. Your student loans have been paid in full as signing bonus. And Northwestern has been informed you'll need schedule flexibility for clinical rotations. The thoroughness of his preparation should have been alarming. Evidence he'd been planning this outcome before she'd agreed to any of it. But Sophia found herself laughing instead, slightly hysterical relief, mixing with acceptance of how completely her life had been reorganized by a single act of compassion 2 weeks ago. "You're incredibly presumptuous," she observed, moving closer until they stood separated by inches rather than feet, her decision apparently made, even if she was still catching up to it emotionally. "I'm incredibly motivated," Dante corrected, his hand finally touching her face with gentleness that contradicted everything else about him, his thumb stroking her cheekbone like she was something precious rather than practical. "You saved my mother. You saved me. You see me as human despite knowing what I am. That's not something I'm willing to lose because I failed to prepare for every possible outcome." The kiss surprised her even though she'd known it was coming, his lips capturing hers with the same controlled intensity he brought to everything, not demanding but absolutely certain of welcome. Sophia let herself fall into it, into him, into the impossible choice that somehow felt more right than any careful decision she'd ever made. When they finally separated, both breathing harder than in kissing alone explained, Dante pressed his forehead to hers in a gesture of intimacy that felt more significant than the kiss. "Thank you," he whispered, the words encompassing more than Sophia could fully process. "For seeing, for acting, for staying. Thank you for making staying possible," she replied, accepting that her life had permanently diverged from the path she'd planned, that normal had been an illusion she'd maintained until crisis revealed what she was actually capable of choosing when survival and connection aligned. The next 3 weeks unfolded in a strange new rhythm as Sophia transitioned from temporary crisis responder to permanent fixture in the Volkov household. Elena recovered fully, her pneumonia resolved, and her strength returned, though Dante insisted she remain at the estate, rather than her own home, until security could be completely overhauled. Sophia worked her final shifts at Memorial, training her replacement while fielding questions from colleagues who couldn't quite believe she was leaving for a private care position. "Doctor," Harrison pulled her aside on her last day, his expression carrying concern that went beyond professional courtesy. "This family you're working for," he said carefully, his words chosen with the precision of someone who suspected more than he could prove. "You're certain you're safe there? That this is truly a career advancement and not something you feel obligated to continue?" The concern was touching even if misplaced, his fatherly worry suggesting he'd connected enough dots to sense danger even if the full picture remained obscured. "I'm safe," Sophia assured him honestly. "Safer than I'd be anywhere else given circumstances I can't fully explain. They're good people, Dr. Harrison. Complicated, but good." He'd accepted her answer with obvious reluctance, but lacking evidence of coercion or danger, he could only wish her well and make her promise to reach out if she ever needed help. The offer was genuine and she appreciated it, even knowing she'd never take him up on it because the help he could offer existed in a different world than the one she now inhabited. Her parents reacted to the news of her position change with pleased surprise, proud their daughter had secured such lucrative private care work, honored that a wealthy family valued her skills enough to offer the kind of compensation that had eliminated her crushing debt overnight. They never questioned the details too closely, accepting her explanation that patient confidentiality prevented her from sharing specifics about the family or their circumstances. David, her brother, proved more skeptical during a visit to the Volkov estate that Sophia arranged carefully, showing him enough to satisfy curiosity while revealing nothing of the truth beneath the surface. He walked the grounds with obvious appreciation for the wealth on display, the lake views and expensive architecture, but his eyes held questions when they finally sat alone in the library. "This family must be incredibly wealthy to afford a live-in nurse," he observed, his tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone testing whether a truthful answer would be provided. "What do they do exactly that generates this kind of money?" "Investments, real estate, import-export businesses," Sophia replied, reciting the legitimate cover story Dante had provided. All technically true, even if radically incomplete. Old family money, mostly. The kind of wealth that's been accumulating for generations. "Import-export," David repeated, his economics major apparently sufficient to recognize how that phrasing often concealed less legal operations. "Right. Well, as long as you're safe and happy, that's what matters." "But Soph," he paused, meeting her eyes with the directness of siblings who'd grown up protecting each other. "If you ever need help getting out of something you got into, without realizing how deep it went, I'm here. No judgment, no questions you don't want to answer, just help." The offer lodged in Sophia's chest, like something sharp and warm simultaneously, proof that her brother saw enough to worry, but loved her enough not to push. "I know," she said simply, taking his hand and squeezing, "but I'm here by choice, David. Strange as that might seem from the outside, this is where I've chosen to be. He'd left looking unconvinced but accepting, his protectiveness satisfied for now by her obvious health and apparent safety, his questions shelved if not forgotten. And Sophia had watched him go with complicated relief, grateful he cared enough to worry but glad he'd never know enough to truly understand. The 4th week marked Sophia's official start as permanent member of the household, her role evolving beyond Elena's care into something more comprehensive. She treated minor injuries that security staff sustained during their work, managed Dante's ongoing chelation therapy and recovery monitoring, maintained medical supplies that covered everything from basic first aid to trauma care that suggested preparation for violence she preferred not imagining. Catherine became not just colleague but mentor, teaching Sophia the peculiar skills required for medical care in circumstances where hospital transfer wasn't always an option, where discretion mattered more than documentation, where keeping people alive sometimes required improvisation that medical boards would never approve. "You're good at this," Catherine observed one afternoon while they were organizing the pharmacy, Sophia's attention to detail and systematic approach earning approval, not just the medicine, but the adaptation. Most nurses couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance of treating people who operate outside the law while maintaining their own ethics. "You've found a balance that works." The compliment landed awkwardly, praise for successfully navigating moral territory. Sophia still wasn't certain she'd mapped correctly. "I just focus on the medical aspects," she deflected. "What happens outside this wing isn't my responsibility." "Except it is," Catherine corrected gently. "The moment you accepted permanent position here, you became part of the structure that enables everything Dante does. You keep him healthy, you keep his mother healthy, you patch up his people when they're injured. That's complicity even if your hands never touch anything criminal. Better to acknowledge it honestly than pretend you're separate from the system you support." The words stung precisely because they were true, articulating what Sophia had been avoiding confronting directly. She wasn't just Dante's girlfriend or Elena's nurse or the household's medical staff. She was infrastructure supporting an organization that operated through violence and intimidation, making her complicit regardless of her personal ethics about harming people. "Does it get easier?" Sophia asked quietly, needing wisdom from someone who'd navigated this territory longer. "Living with the contradictions? Knowing you're healing people who hurt others?" Catherine considered the question while labeling medication containers with precise handwriting. "It gets different," she finally said. "You stop thinking in absolutes about good and evil, right and wrong. You recognize that most people are complicated, that circumstances matter, that sometimes preventing greater harm requires accepting lesser harm. It's not easy, but it becomes sustainable if you maintain your own boundaries and remember why you're here." Why was Sophia here? The question had multiple answers depending on which truth she was willing to admit. She was here because Dante's protection kept her family safe. She was here because Elena had become a surrogate family in ways that transcended their nurse-patient relationship. She was here because Dante himself had become someone who mattered beyond professional obligation or strategic alliance, his complexity and contradictions somehow making him more compelling rather than less. That evening, Sophia found Dante in his office, reviewing reports that detailed operations she deliberately didn't ask about, maintaining the separation she'd negotiated even as boundaries became increasingly theoretical. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening in ways that only seemed to happen when they were alone, his public control dissolving into something warmer and more accessible. "How was your day?" he asked, the mundane question somehow feeling significant coming from him, domestic normally existing alongside criminal empire management. "Catherine says I'm complicit in everything you do by keeping you healthy enough to do it," Sophia replied, deciding honesty was better than pretending she wasn't struggling with the implications. "She's not wrong, but it's still difficult to reconcile with why I became a nurse in the first place." Dante set aside his work, giving her his full attention with the focus he brought to things he considered important. "You became a nurse to help people. You still do that. You help my mother, me, our people when they're injured. The fact that we exist in morally complicated territory doesn't erase the good you do. But I'm part of the machinery," Sophia said quietly, "even if I never touch the weapons." "Yes," Dante agreed simply, surprising her with his lack of defensiveness. "You are, and I won't insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise or rationalizing it as somehow separate. You've chosen to be part of this world, and that comes with complicity you'll have to reconcile with your own ethics. I can't do that work for you, Sophia. I can only tell you that your presence here makes things better, not worse. You've saved 2 lives, prevented suffering, and brought humanity into spaces that desperately need it. The words shouldn't have been comforting given they acknowledged rather than absolved her complicity, but somehow Dante's honesty helped more than reassurance. Would have. He wasn't pretending she was innocent or that her choices didn't carry weight. He was acknowledging the reality and trusting her to navigate it according to her own conscience. "I'm still figuring out how to live with this," she admitted, voicing vulnerability she rarely allowed herself. "How to be the person who saves lives while being connected to someone who takes them." Dante stood, moving around the desk to where she sat, his hand finding hers and pulling her to her feet. "Then we figure it out together," he said, his arms wrapping around her in an embrace that felt like shelter despite everything it represented. "One day at a time, one decision at a time, one boundary at a time. You maintain your ethics. I respect them, even when they complicate my operations. And we trust that our individual integrity combined is stronger than the system we're both part of." Sophia let herself lean into him, accepting the comfort even while recognizing the contradiction it represented. She was being held by someone whose hands had signed orders that ended lives, whose decisions rippled through Chicago's underworld, causing consequences she preferred not imagining. But those same hands touched her with gentleness, protected his mother with devotion, and carried responsibility that would have crushed someone with less strength. People were complicated. That's what Catherine had said, and Sophia was learning the truth of it through direct experience rather than academic study. 3 months later, on a February evening when Chicago was buried under snow that made the world seem cleaner than it was, Sophia found Elena in the kitchen teaching her to make blini, Russian pancakes that required patience and the kind of technique that only came through practice. They worked in comfortable silence punctuated by occasional instruction, the domestic ritual feeling like family in ways that transcended blood or circumstances. "You're happy here," Elena observed, the statement, rather than question suggesting she'd been watching Sophia's adaptation with maternal attention. "Even with all the complications, you've found your place." Sophia considered the observation while flipping a pancake with technique that was improving but still imperfect. Was she happy? The question felt more complex than Elena probably intended, happiness seeming too simple a word for the intricate mixture of emotions that defined her life now. "I'm satisfied," she finally answered, choosing her words carefully. "I'm doing work that matters, helping people who need it, building something with Dante that feels real despite being complicated. That's not exactly happiness, but it's something that feels sustainable and meaningful." Elena smiled, her expression holding the wisdom of someone who'd navigated similar territory decades earlier when she'd chosen to stand beside Dante's father, despite understanding what that choice meant. "That's love, Doragaya," she said gently. "Not the fairy tale version that ignores reality, but the complicated adult version that sees truth and chooses partnership anyway. You'll understand eventually that what you and Dante have is rare, worth protecting despite the difficulties." The words settled into Sophia's consciousness like seeds that would take time to fully germinate, planting possibilities she wasn't quite ready to fully acknowledge but couldn't entirely deny. Love felt too significant a label for what had developed between her and Dante, too intimate and permanent for something that had started with a note about poison and evolved through crisis management. But watching Dante enter the kitchen moments later, his expression transforming when he saw them cooking together, his kiss greeting his mother before finding Sophia's lips with casual affection, that suggested belonging. Maybe Elena wasn't wrong about what they'd built together during these months of learning to navigate impossible territory. That night, lying in bed, beside Dante in the room that had gradually transformed from guest quarters to shared space, Sophia stared at the ceiling while his breathing deepened into sleep. Her phone sat on the nightstand displaying the time, 11:47 p.m., nearly 4 months exactly since she'd written a note warning about poison in an IV. 4 months since her life had changed irrevocably, since she'd stepped from invisibility into visibility, since she'd chosen compassion over safety and triggered a cascade of consequences that had restructured everything. She'd lost her anonymity, her simple career path, her illusion of existing separate from Chicago's criminal infrastructure. But she'd gained protection for her family, a purpose that extended beyond managing symptoms into actually preventing harm, a partnership with someone who saw her completely and wanted her anyway, and belonging in a family that had claimed her as their own. The cost-benefit analysis wasn't simple or clean. Medical ethics boards would be appalled by her choices. Her nursing school professors would consider her a cautionary tale. But Sophia had learned that ethics in practice were messier than ethics in textbooks, that sometimes the right choice involved breaking rules designed to protect institutions rather than individuals. She'd saved 2 lives by violating protocols, by trusting instinct over procedure. by choosing human connection over professional distance. And she'd discovered that she could live with the contradictions, could maintain her integrity while existing in morally complicated territory, could love someone dangerous without becoming dangerous herself. 4 months ago, she'd been just a nurse. Now she was Sophia Chen, nurse practitioner student, Elena Volkov's surrogate daughter, Dante Volkov's partner, and permanent fixture in a household where love and violence coexisted in ways that made sense once you understood that people were complicated, that circumstances mattered, and that choosing to see humanity in others required accepting your own complexity first. The journey from that moment in room 304 to this moment in Dante's bed hadn't been the path she'd planned. But lying there in the dark, listening to his breathing and thinking about Elena's Bleeny lesson in the medical suite where she'd treat tomorrow's inevitable minor crisis, Sophia realized this unplanned path had led somewhere she'd unconsciously been searching for without knowing it. Home, complicated and contradictory, and absolutely, imperfectly hers. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story of Sophia and Dante's unexpected journey from a single act of compassion to building something real despite impossible circumstances, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.